The first thing they teach you at the academy is how to read a room. Walk in, scan left to right, identify the exits, clock every face, file every detail. 22 years on the force, and I still do it automatically, even when I'm not working. Grocery stores, church, my sister's kitchen on Thanksgiving. My eyes never stop moving. But nobody taught me what to do when the room you're reading is one where you don't exist. That's the thing about going undercover as a poor woman in America. You don't need a disguise. You don't need a fake ID or a cover story or a wig. You just need to dress like you shop at Goodwill, carry a canvas tote bag instead of a leather purse, and let your shoulders drop half an inch. That's all it takes. Suddenly you're invisible. Suddenly people look right through you like you're a smudge on a window. I know because I am that woman. Or at least I used to be. Before the badge, before the department, before 22 years of pretending I belonged somewhere that was always trying to remind me I didn't. My name is Vivian Elise Monroe. I'm 45 years old. I'm a detective with the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police, Financial Crimes Division, and for the past 11 months, I have been living a double life that started because of a gas station receipt. Let me explain. It began on a Tuesday in November, which is the ugliest month in Pittsburgh. Not the dramatic ugliness of January, when the Monongahela freezes at the edges, and the wind off the Allegheny will find every gap in your coat and fill it with ice. November is worse because it can't commit. The sky goes gray-brown, the trees are bare, but the ground hasn't frozen yet, and everything smells like wet leaves and disappointment. November in Pittsburgh is the month that reminds you that winter is coming, and you are not ready, and you will never be ready. I was in my car outside of Sunoco on Penn Avenue, eating a gas station breakfast sandwich that I'd told myself I wasn't going to eat, reviewing case files on my laptop. Financial crimes is not glamorous work. It's spreadsheets and property records and phone logs and the slow, grinding work of following money from one account to another until you find the place where it disappears. It's the kind of work that makes you good at noticing patterns and bad at conversation, and it had been making me both of those things for 6 years. The case I was reviewing was routine, or what passed for routine in financial crimes. A complaint had been filed by the adult children of several elderly residents at the Meadowbrook Senior Living Community on the east side. The complaint alleged financial irregularities in the management of resident trust accounts, money that families deposited for their loved ones' expenses, medication, personal items, the small dignities of daily life, going missing or misallocated. It was the kind of case that sounded important until you pulled the file and realized it was almost certainly administrative error, an overworked billing department, maybe some low-level employee skimming small amounts. A few $1,000s at most. The kind of thing that resolved with a settlement and a fired bookkeeper and nobody going to prison. I was about to reassign it to a junior detective when something caught my eye. The complaint had been filed by the adult children of the affected residents. I started pulling background on the complainants as a matter of routine, and that's when the pattern appeared. Marcus Ellison, son of resident Dorothy Ellison, age 81. Marcus was a hedge fund manager in New York. Estimated net worth, $14 million. Jennifer Krause, daughter of resident Harold Krause, age 78. Jennifer was a real estate developer in Philadelphia. Estimated net worth, $8.5 million. Thomas Wentworth III, son of resident Evelyn Wentworth, age 84. Thomas ran a private equity firm in Chicago. Estimated net worth, $31 million. I sat with that for a minute. 3 adult children. Combined net worth somewhere north of $50 million. Filing a complaint about missing trust account funds. I looked at the amounts alleged. Dorothy Ellison, $2,400 unaccounted for over 18 months. Harold Krause, $1,800. Evelyn Wentworth, $3,100. My gas station sandwich sat in my lap and got cold. I did the math 3 times because I needed to make sure I wasn't misreading it. $53 million in personal wealth between the 3 complainants, and they were filing police complaints about a combined total of $7,300. In my experience, People with $50 million don't file police complaints about $7,000. They hire attorneys and make phone calls and apply quiet, expensive pressure until the problem goes away. You file a police complaint when you're desperate, when the quiet channels have stopped working, when you've tried everything else. I called the senior center. Meadowbrook Senior Living Community was on a residential street in Squirrel Hill, a neighborhood of brick houses and mature oaks, and a particular brand of Pittsburgh respectability that had been holding on since the 1950s. The facility itself was a large converted Victorian house with additions built in every decade since, creating that architectural patchwork that institutional buildings accumulate like rings on a tree. The sign out front was tasteful. The parking lot was well maintained. The lobby smelled like industrial cleaner with an overlay of something floral that was trying very hard. The director who met me was named Gerald Ashworth. He was 60, pink-faced, wearing a blazer that cost more than my monthly car payment, and he had the particular smile of a man who has spent decades managing situations that could become problems and keeping them from doing so. "Detective Monroe," he said, offering a hand that was manicured in a way that men's hands don't usually get manicured unless someone is paying a great deal of attention to appearances. "This is about the billing inquiries. Not complaint. Not investigation. Inquiries. It's about a reported financial discrepancy in resident trust accounts," I said. "I'd like to speak with some of the residents directly, if that's possible." His smile tightened by about 4%. Our residents are elderly, and many of them experience significant cognitive difficulties. I'm not sure how productive that would be. "Humor me," I said. He gave me a tour first, which told me more than the tour was intended to tell. The facility was beautiful in its public spaces. The lobby, the dining room, the garden visible through large windows. Bright colors, new furniture, artwork on the walls that had clearly been selected by someone with a budget and a decorator. It looked like the kind of place you'd feel good about putting your mother. But I've been a detective for a long time. I noticed things. The dining room smelled good, and the tables were set nicely, but when I looked at the residents eating, I noticed the portions were small. Not diet small. Institution rationing small. The kind of small that comes from a kitchen operating under a budget that doesn't match what families are paying. The activity room had a large flat-screen TV and shelves of books and puzzles, but the shelves hadn't been restocked in a while. Several puzzles had pieces missing. The television was tuned to a channel nobody seemed to be watching, and the residents themselves. I kept looking at the residents. Not at their faces, but at their clothes, their shoes, the small personal items on the tables next to their chairs. I've interviewed enough elderly people in enough different circumstances to know the difference between someone living comfortably and someone living carefully. And the residents of Meadowbrook were living carefully in a facility that charged $6,500 a month per person. Gerald Ashworth walked me through the building talking about their award-winning care model and their individualized wellness plans and their partnership with UPMC for medical oversight, and I nodded and said appropriate things, and I looked at the residents and I thought about $53 million. I got one conversation with a resident that day. Her name was Dorothy Ellison, the mother of Marcus the hedge fund manager, and she was 81 years old and sharp as a tack. She had been a high school principal for 30 years in the Penn Hills district. She sat in a chair by the window in her room, a room that was clean and bright, but smaller than my office, which is not a large office. And she looked at me with the kind of eyes that have spent decades reading teenagers who think they're getting away with something. "You're police," she said. "Gerald thinks you're just doing a routine check. He's wrong." I liked her immediately. "My son filed a complaint," she said. "About the money. I told him not to. I told him it would just make things worse." "Why would it make things worse?" She looked at me for a long moment, the way someone looks when they're deciding whether to trust you. I've been on the receiving end of that look thousands of times, and I still can't predict which way it'll go. "Because," she said, "the man who runs this place has friends. Important friends. And I'm 81 years old, and I have dementia. According to my records. She paused. I don't have dementia. I felt something happen in my chest. Not the professional recognition of a lead. Something more personal than that. Something that sat heavier. Tell me about the money, I said. It took me 3 weeks to build the picture, and when the picture came together, it was bigger and uglier than anything I'd expected. Meadowbrook Senior Living was one of 12 facilities in the Pittsburgh-Philadelphia corridor owned by a holding company called Keystone Elder Care Partners. The CEO and majority shareholder of Keystone was a man named Harlan Drake, 63 years old, a graduate of Wharton, a board member of 3 nonprofits focused on elderly welfare, a donor to the mayor's campaign, and a man whose name appeared in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette's annual list of most influential citizens 4 years running. He was also, I was increasingly certain, running a systematic fraud operation against the families of elderly residents that had, over 7 years, extracted somewhere between $8 and $12 million from people who had trusted him with the most vulnerable members of their families. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. Families deposited large sums into resident trust accounts, money for medications, personal care, activities, clothing, incidentals. The accounts were managed by Keystone's centralized billing department. Keystone billed against these accounts for services and supplies. The billing was opaque, detailed enough to look legitimate, vague enough to make verification difficult. Medications billed at 4 times retail cost. Activities charged for that never occurred. Personal care services invoiced for residents who were too cognitively impaired to confirm or deny receiving them. And underneath all of that, something else. Something that took me longer to find because it was more carefully hidden. Several of the residents had significant assets, homes, savings, retirement accounts, that had been placed in financial instruments managed by a subsidiary of Keystone. Power of attorney documents, signed by residents or their families in moments of transition and stress, that gave Keystone representatives broad authority over financial decisions. Assets that were being quietly liquidated, and the proceeds absorbed into the corporate structure through a series of shell companies that I traced across 4 states over 11 sleepless days. The adult children who had filed complaints, Marcus Ellison, Jennifer Krause, Thomas Wentworth. They had noticed the trust account irregularities because they were wealthy and financially sophisticated, and they reviewed statements. But they hadn't seen the deeper level. Nobody had seen it except Harlan Drake and the small team of people who helped him operate it. I brought my findings to my lieutenant, a man named Carl Rosewood, who had been a good cop for 30 years, and was now, at 58, primarily focused on not making waves in the final years before his pension vested. He looked at my spreadsheets and my timelines and my corporate ownership charts and he said, "Viv, this is a lot." "It's fraud," I said. "Systematic, intentional, multi-year fraud against elderly and their families. It's complicated fraud against well-connected targets." He paused. "Harlan Drake sits on the mayor's commission on housing. His lawyer plays golf with the DA. I'm aware. I'm not saying we don't pursue it." Another pause. "I'm saying we need more. We need something airtight. Because if we go at Harlan Drake and miss, we don't get another shot." He wasn't wrong. I hate when he's not wrong. "What do you need?" he asked. I looked at my files. I looked at Dorothy Ellison's face in my memory. Her careful, precise eyes. Her careful, precise mind. Her careful assessment of exactly how much trouble she could cause from a chair in a small room in a facility she couldn't leave. "I need to go inside," I said. Here's the thing about going undercover that nobody tells you when you're watching television. It doesn't feel dangerous in the way you expect. The danger you prepare for is physical. The wrong person recognizing you. The cover story cracking. The moment where everything goes wrong fast. That danger is real, but it's not constant. The danger nobody prepares you for is the slow one. The psychological erosion of pretending to be someone you're not, for days and then weeks and then months, until you start losing track of where the pretending ends and you begin. I was going in as a prospective employee, not as a detective, not as an investigator, as a woman looking for work. I'd done undercover before, twice, and I knew the mechanics. The department created a complete identity for me. Viv Carson, 52, of Hazelwood, recently widowed, looking for part-time work as a personal care aide after raising 2 kids and watching her savings get eaten by her late husband's medical bills. The kind of woman who takes whatever work is available and doesn't ask too many questions because the rent is due. I want to be honest here because it matters. I almost didn't do it. Not because I was afraid of Drake or his lawyers or his golf-playing friends. I almost didn't do it because the woman I was pretending to be was uncomfortably close to who I might have been. I grew up in Hazelwood. My father worked at the mill. I got out through the police academy and 22 years of grinding work, and I carry that origin story with me the way you carry a scar. It's healed over, but it pulls sometimes, especially in cold weather. Putting on the Goodwill clothes and the worn shoes and letting my posture go was not as easy as I'd expected. It wasn't theater. It was memory. I told myself I was fine. I was lying. Meadowbrook hired me in 3 days. The HR coordinator was a young woman named Brittany, who was kind and efficient, and who, I noticed, looked slightly uncomfortable the entire time she was processing my paperwork. The kind of uncomfortable that comes from knowing something is wrong and having made the choice to stop examining what it is. My first shift was a Thursday morning. 6 a.m., the smell of institutional coffee and floor cleaner, a locker room where I changed into the aide's uniform, pale blue scrubs, and met the 3 other aides I'd be working with. Denise, 47, from Homewood, had been at Meadowbrook for 6 years and had the specific exhaustion of someone who genuinely cares about their work, but has been systematically under-resourced in the doing of it. Marceline, 24, who was working 2 jobs and going to nursing school and surviving on 4 hours of sleep and considerable personal force of will. And Bobby, 31, who had the cheerful, slightly manic energy of someone who needs the job too much to let it get him down. I liked all 3 of them within an hour. That was a complication I hadn't fully planned for. The work itself was what it was. Assisting residents with morning routines, medication administration, meals, activities. I'd had training, both formal as part of my cover preparation and informal. I'd spent 3 years in my 20s as a home care aide before the academy, a fact I'd mentioned to exactly no one in financial crimes. It meant my cover was genuine in ways that made it easier to maintain and harder to leave. I was looking for 3 things: documentation of billing fraud, evidence of the asset liquidation scheme, and any direct link between the facility's management and Harlan Drake's office. I was also supposed to be looking for a contact inside the organization, someone with access to financial records who might be willing to cooperate. What I found in the first 2 weeks was mostly just the facility itself and the people in it, and what it felt like to spend 8 hours a day caring for elderly people who were being systematically robbed. Eleanor Hutchins, 87, who had been a jazz pianist and whose arthritis now prevented her from playing, but who hummed constantly, under her breath, the standard she'd recorded with a quartet in 1974. She was being billed for a music therapy program that met twice a week. I was there twice a week. The program met once, led by a volunteer who came for 45 minutes and whose documentation was being filed as 90-minute sessions. Robert Bobby Fontaine, 82, Korean War veteran, former steelworker from the North Side, with a sense of humor that was sharp enough to cut you if you didn't see it coming. His trust account showed regular charges for a premium physical therapy package. He told me with considerable specificity that nobody had worked with him on physical therapy since February. It was November. And Dorothy Ellison, my first contact, who had told me not to trust the records. Every time I helped her with her morning routine, she looked at me with those principal's eyes, and I felt certain she knew something wasn't right about me, and I felt certain she wasn't going to say anything, because she was playing a longer game than I was. One morning, while I was helping her with her breakfast, she said, without looking up from her oatmeal, "Whatever you're looking for, Try the third-floor storage room, the one they keep locked. I kept my face completely neutral. I don't know what you mean, I said. No, she said. Of course not. She took a spoonful of oatmeal. The door code is the facility's zip code. It's been the same for 4 years because Gerald is not a careful man. She went back to her breakfast. I went back to my rounds. The third-floor storage room took me another week to get to because of the cameras. Meadowbrook had security cameras in all the common areas and hallways, which was entirely normal and appropriate for a care facility, and also thoroughly inconvenient for my purposes. I spent a week mapping the gaps in coverage, which required me to be simultaneously present as an aide and observant as an investigator, without letting either role compromise the other, and I want to say clearly that it was harder than it sounds. I was also, during this period, living in a one-bedroom apartment in Hazelwood. Not my actual apartment in Lawrenceville, but a cover address we'd set up. And going home every night to a space that smelled like other people's lives, and eating dinner alone and trying to remember who I actually was. The self-doubt doesn't announce itself. It creeps. I'd be in the middle of documenting a billing irregularity in my secure notes, and I'd think, what if I'm wrong? What if this is all explainable? What if I've built a theory out of coincidences, and my lieutenant was right, and Drake has connections we can't fight? I'd been doing this for 22 years, and I still walked into every investigation half convinced I was going to miss something obvious that anyone smarter would have caught in the first hour. My therapist calls it imposter syndrome. I call it Tuesday. The storage room visit happened on a Saturday night, third shift, when the facility ran on a skeleton crew, and the cameras on the east stairwell had a 12-minute gap between sweeps that Marceline had mentioned offhandedly one day as the window she used to make personal calls without being observed. I used it differently. The zip code worked. The room was large and climate-controlled, which was the first thing that told me it wasn't used for ordinary storage. Filing cabinets, 4 of them, each with a padlock. A desk with a shredder that hadn't been emptied. A laptop on the desk, locked. I had 45 minutes before the next camera sweep caught the stairwell. I photographed everything I could reach. The labels on the filing cabinets, the documents in the shredder basket that hadn't been fully processed, the sticky notes on the edge of the desk that someone had left because human beings are terrible at operational security, even when they're trying to commit sophisticated fraud. One of those sticky notes had a phone number, a name, and a date 3 weeks out. The name was Harlan Drake. I want to tell you that getting that note was the moment everything came together, because that's how these stories are supposed to go. But the reality was that getting the note was the moment everything got harder. I photographed it and put it back exactly where I'd found it, and got out of the room with 7 minutes to spare, and went back to my rounds and helped Eleanor Hutchins with her midnight medication, and listened to Bobby Fontaine tell me about the 1979 World Series for the 3rd time. Because it was the only year the Pirates had won in his adult lifetime and he needed to tell someone about it. And I went home at 6 a.m. and looked at the photograph of the sticky note and thought about what I had and what I still needed. What I had: a name, a phone number, a date. Circumstantial. Not enough. What I needed: financial records linking Drake's corporate structure directly to the fraud. Not just billing irregularities. The asset liquidation. The money that had moved from residents' investment accounts into shell companies. That evidence lived somewhere in the locked filing cabinets I couldn't open and the laptop I couldn't access. I had 3 weeks before the date on that note. I spent 2 of them trying to find a way into those cabinets and coming up empty each time. And in the 3rd week, something happened that I hadn't planned for. Gerald Ashworth fired Denise. He fired her for a documentation error, a medication log that had an incorrect timestamp, and he did it on a Tuesday morning in the break room in front of everyone, which told me everything I needed to know about Gerald Ashworth, and nothing I didn't already suspect. Denise had worked at Meadowbrook for 6 years. She had effectively been the institutional memory of the facility, the person the other aides came to with questions, the person the residents trusted because she'd earned it over thousands of mornings and evenings and nights. She came back to the break room to collect her things, and I helped her pack her locker, and I gave her my cover phone number, and I told her to call me if she needed anything. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I recognized. The look of someone deciding whether to say the thing they've been not saying for a long time. They fired the last person who asked about the billing, she said quietly. What person? A woman named Renata, 3 years ago. She was in accounting, part-time. She noticed some things and she asked about them, and 2 weeks later she was let go for cause. Denise finished packing her bag. I never asked. I should have asked. I know I should have asked. She looked at me with the specific guilt of someone who made a reasonable choice under impossible circumstances and has been living with it ever since. I have 2 kids. I know, I said. You're not really just an aide, are you? She said. It wasn't a question. I looked at her for a long moment. What makes you say that? Because you care too much, she said. The new ones, they're either burned out by the 3rd week, or they stop seeing the residents as people. You've been here 2 weeks and you still see them. She picked up her bag. Whatever you're doing, be careful. She left. I sat in the break room for 3 minutes, which is the maximum amount of time I permit myself to feel things during an active investigation. Then I went back to work. The last week before the date on the sticky note was when everything nearly fell apart. It happened because of Harlan Drake himself, which I should have anticipated but didn't. He came to the facility on a Wednesday. Not announced. Not the kind of visit that gets written on the calendar. A private car, a side entrance, 30 minutes in Gerald's office on the 2nd floor. I found out because Bobby Fontaine told me he'd seen a man in a suit going into the building from his window, the way men in his generation watched streets and noted strangers as a basic habit of urban living. I found an excuse to be in the 2nd floor hallway, not near the office. I'm not reckless. But close enough to see Gerald Ashworth's face when Drake left, and the face told me something I hadn't expected. Gerald Ashworth was afraid. Not the managed anxiety of a business conversation gone sideways. Genuinely frightened. The kind of face a person makes when they have realized, perhaps recently, that they are in something they cannot get out of. I knew that face because I'd seen it in interview rooms. It was the face of someone who is no longer a participant in a scheme, but a captive of one. I went home that night and did something I almost never do. I called my sister Patricia in Bethel Park and talked to her for an hour about nothing in particular. About her kids. About the Thanksgiving plans we kept postponing. About the house on our street in Hazelwood where we grew up that had a new family in it now. I didn't tell her what I was working on. I never tell her what I'm working on. But I needed to hear her voice and remember that there was a version of my life that existed outside the undercover. She said, at the end, "You sound tired, Viv." I'm fine. You always say that. I'm always fine. She didn't believe me. She never believes me. She is correct not to believe me. The solution appeared, as solutions sometimes do, in a place I hadn't thought to look because I'd been looking at the wrong level. It was Dorothy Ellison who found it. Or rather, Dorothy Ellison, who told me it had been there the entire time. 3 days before the date on the sticky note, she asked me to help her move a box from the top shelf of her closet. The box was her personal files, decades of documents she'd maintained with the precision of someone who had spent their career managing institutions and understood that paper was the only evidence that outlasted memory. "I've been here 2 years," she said while I was moving the box. "When I moved in, they had me sign a lot of paperwork. My son helped, but he was distracted. He was in the middle of a deal, and he flew in for one day and we were rushing." She paused. "I signed a document. I thought it was about my medical decisions. I found out later it also gave Keystone authority to manage my financial accounts." Another pause. "But I'd already signed another document, 3 months earlier, when I was setting up my estate, with my own attorney, and that document was more specific and more recent in relevant ways." I looked at her. "I have both documents," she said. "And I have been corresponding, very carefully, with my attorney in Pittsburgh for the past 4 months. He has copies of both. And he has been documenting the discrepancies between what Keystone's authority document says it permits and what Keystone has actually been doing with my accounts. She opened the box and took out a manila envelope and held it out to me. "Dorothy," I said carefully, "how long have you known?" "That you're police?" She thought about it. 3 weeks. "And you waited?" "I needed to know if you were actually going to do something," she said, "or if you were going to build a case and hand it up and have it get buried by someone who plays golf with the right people." I took the envelope. "I'm going to do something," I said. She looked at me with those principal's eyes. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm giving it to you." The envelope contained 4 years of careful, meticulous documentation. Dorothy Ellison had spent 4 years in her small room in that facility, building the case I had been trying to build for 11 months. Bank statements, account notifications, correspondence, a detailed timeline of transactions with annotations, the kind of evidence that only comes from someone who was there, who had standing, whose name was on the accounts, whose story could not be explained away as the confusion of a cognitively impaired elderly woman. Because she didn't have dementia. And she could prove it. Her attorney had arranged independent neuropsychological testing 6 months earlier. She was sharp. The dementia notation in her file was Keystone's insurance policy against exactly this moment. I took the envelope to Carl Rosewood the next morning and put it on his desk and watched his face change. "Where did this come from?" he said. "A witness," I said. "A very good one." He read for 15 minutes without speaking. I watched the expression on his face go from skepticism to concentration, to something I recognized as the particular gravity of a good cop who has just understood the full dimensions of what he's looking at. "We need the DA's office," he said. "I have a contact there," I said. "One who doesn't golf?" He looked at me. "How confident are you in this?" Here is where 22 years of telling myself I wasn't good enough either serves you or fails you. This was my moment of reckoning. The junction where the self-doubt either wins or doesn't. I thought about Dorothy Ellison in her chair. Eleanor Hutchins humming a jazz standard she could no longer play. Bobby Fontaine and the 1979 World Series. Denise, packing her locker with a look on her face that cost her nothing to have and everything to live with. Gerald Ashworth's frightened eyes in a hallway on a Wednesday afternoon. I thought about Harlan Drake, who had built a machine for harvesting money from the most vulnerable people in his care, and who had friends in high places, and who had been doing it for 7 years without consequence, in part because the women doing the work of caring for his victims were invisible in every room they walked into. "Very confident," I said. I meant it. What followed was 2 weeks of work so intense and focused that I moved through it the way you move through certain kinds of physical pain, not ignoring it but incorporating it, letting it become part of the rhythm rather than fighting it. The DA assigned a young prosecutor named Angela Chen, who had the terrifying energy of someone who has chosen her career specifically for moments like this one and has been waiting patiently for it to arrive. Together we built the case from Dorothy's documentation, cross-referencing it with the records I'd gathered undercover, the photographs from the storage room, the corporate filings I'd traced through 4 states. The date on the sticky note turned out to be a scheduled meeting between Drake and his compliance attorney, a meeting we arranged to know about through a warrant on Drake's communication records, approved by a judge who was notably not on the mayor's commission, and notably did not play golf. Gerald Ashworth, when approached by Angela Chen and 2 federal agents on a Thursday morning outside his house in Mount Lebanon, did not hesitate. He had been waiting, I think, for this conversation for years. He had reached the point where the weight of what he knew had become more unbearable than the consequences of saying it. He gave us everything. Names, accounts, transaction records, emails. He cried twice during the initial interview, and I believed his remorse was genuine, which did not change what he'd done, but which I registered as human because these things are almost never simple. The arrest of Harlan Drake happened on a Friday morning. I wasn't there. My lieutenant kept me away from it because I was a witness, not an arresting officer, and because good procedure requires that. I heard about it through Angela Chen's text, which said only, Done. 12 counts. He had a lawyer there in 4 minutes. Good lawyers can't undo the evidence Dorothy gave us. I sat in my car outside the Sunoco on Penn Avenue, the same parking lot where I'd first noticed the discrepancy in the complaint file 11 months earlier. And I ate another gas station breakfast sandwich, and I cried for approximately 7 minutes, which is 7 minutes more than I typically permit myself, but which I decided was acceptable given the circumstances. I went back to Meadowbrook once more, out of uniform, as myself. Vivian Monroe, Detective, Financial Crimes. I talked to Dorothy Ellison in her room by the window. She had known the whole time, she confirmed. Not in the beginning, not when she first arrived. But within the first year, she had started to understand what was happening to her accounts. And she'd started documenting, quietly, because she was a woman who had run institutions and understood how power worked, and understood that the only leverage available to an 81-year-old woman in a care facility was documentation. "Your son knew you were doing this?" I asked. "He knew I was concerned. He didn't know the extent." She looked out the window. "Marcus is a good boy. He's just very busy." The note in that sentence, the gentle irony, the love that coexists with clear-eyed assessment, was one of the more complicated things I'd heard in a long time. "You were never confused," I said. "No." A pause. "But it's useful to let people believe you are. People underestimate the confused old woman in the corner." She looked at me. The same way they underestimate the woman in the worn shoes. I thought about that. "Did you figure it out right away?" I asked. "That I was undercover?" "Not immediately. The second week, you were too good at the work for someone who claimed not to have done it before. Personal care isn't intuitive. It takes time to learn how to move with someone, how to anticipate what they need without making them feel like they're being managed. You moved like you'd done it before." She tilted her head. "Had you?" "A long time ago," I said. She nodded, like that confirmed something she'd already concluded. "The thing you need to understand," she said, "is that the reason they got away with it for so long is not because Harlan Drake was particularly clever. It's because the people with the most to lose had the least standing. We were old, we were ill, some of us. Our children were busy. The people caring for us were underpaid and exhausted. And none of us were the kind of people who the right authorities look at first when something goes wrong." She paused. "You found it because you came in through the door nobody was watching." "The door nobody was watching," I repeated. "There's always one," she said. "In every institution, in every situation. A door that the powerful people don't guard because they can't imagine anyone significant using it." She picked up her book, which was a signal that the conversation was at a natural end, and then she said without looking up, "You're better at your job than you think you are, Detective Monroe." I stood in the doorway for a moment. "I'm working on it," I said. Harlan Drake pled not guilty to all 12 counts and immediately hired the most expensive defense attorneys in Pennsylvania. Angela Chen told me on the phone the day the indictment was unsealed that she'd been expecting this and had been preparing for it since the first day, and that she was not even slightly concerned. She said it with the flat confidence of someone who has 12 counts of federal fraud charges, supported by 4 years of meticulous documentation, and a former principal from Penn Hills, who had been building her case since before most of the legal team was hired. "The trial is scheduled for next spring. I'm told it will last 3 weeks. The money? A recovery operation is underway, involving federal authorities and a forensic accounting firm, and the kind of careful, slow, unglamorous work that my division does every day. Some of it will come back. Some of it won't. The nature of financial crime is that money dispersed through shell companies across 4 states takes years to fully reconstruct. The people it came from are in their 70s and 80s, and some of them won't live to see full restitution. That's the honest truth of it, and I'm not going to soften it. Gerald Ashworth lost his position and faces his own charges, reduced in exchange for cooperation. He's living in Mount Lebanon and waiting for sentencing. Brittany, the HR coordinator who processed my fake application, resigned. Denise was offered her position back and declined, which I respect completely. Meadowbrook is under new management, a nonprofit operator with a track record of legitimate elder care, appointed by the court as conservator while the legal process continues. Bobby Fontaine told me, when I visited last month, that the physical therapy actually happens now. He said it with the satisfaction of a man who has been waiting a long time for the obvious to be acknowledged. Eleanor Hutchins got a keyboard. Small, electronic, fits on a table in her room. Her arthritis makes it hard to play for long stretches, but she plays most evenings, and the other residents gather in the common room to listen, and the notes drift down the hallway in the particular way that music does when it's being played by someone who learned music before they learned anything else. I transferred out of undercover work after the Drake case, not because it broke me. I want to be clear about that. But because it clarified something for me that I'd been avoiding clarifying. I spent 22 years believing that the way I survived in a job that didn't always want me was to be invisible in a different way. To be so competent, so controlled, so relentlessly useful that I took up no space that couldn't be justified by output. I ate bad sandwiches alone in parking lots, and I went home to empty apartments, and I cried 7 minutes maximum in cars, and I told my sister I was fine. The woman I was pretending to be in that facility was not a performance. She was a version of me I'd never let myself be. Present, visible, doing the work for its own sake rather than for what the work proved about me. I am still figuring out what to do with that. What I know is this. There are rooms where invisible people do the most important work, where the people no one looks twice at are watching everything and remembering everything and building the cases that the powerful people never see coming. Where an 81-year-old woman with bad insurance and a small room and no one paying attention spends 4 years collecting the evidence that brings down a $12 million fraud operation because she is, in the final analysis, the most dangerous person in any room she occupies. I think about that room. The door nobody was watching. I think about who I was when I walked through it, and who I was when I walked out. I think about Vivian Carson, in her worn shoes and her Goodwill dress, invisible in every hallway she walked down. I think about what she was capable of, and about how long it took me to understand that she and I were the same person. If you listened to this story today and something in it felt familiar, the room where no one sees you, the work that goes unrecognized, the feeling that you are capable of more than anyone in your vicinity seems to believe, I want to say something to you directly. The door nobody is watching is the most important door in the building, and you already know how to use it. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read everyone, and if you know someone who needs to hear it, send it to them. Some stories find people at exactly the right moment. Until next time.